Thank you, Rodney.
Thank you, Dave.
Zachary. That was a very techonomic discussion, in my opinion. I think that Rodney is one of the most creative thinkers in the technology industry, and some of the stuff he was talking about there is pretty cutting edge. It's interesting, he wasn't just promoting Baxter, he was really thinking about a whole new way of making things, moving towards an economy that's much more localized, and I think that'll be extremely related to the conversation you're about to hear about the do-it-yourself economy, the maker movement, which is very trendy these days, but I think it's real, and those little factories that Rodney showed in his chalkboard diagram are really what this next session is about. And the moderator is Lou Rossi, a principal at McKinsey. So if the panelists and Lou are ready, come on out. Do you have your mics on?
I think we're ready.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Lou Rossi with McKinsey & Company. Please allow me a moment to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, we have Matt Clayson, is Director of Detroit Creative Corridor Center. Among his many contributions, he's been instrumental in linking Midtown with downtown here in Detroit and playing an important role in the entrepreneurial success stories here in Detroit, including Shinola. Next, we have Chad Dickerson, CEO of Etsy. Etsy, as you all know, is the de facto distribution platform for the maker movement, now over 1 million users. And an interesting fact I came to learn is that roughly 99% of all Americans live in the same zip code as an Etsy seller, which we'll enjoy hearing Chad talk about. Next, we have Marlene Vogler, who is the Chief Strategy Officer and co-founder of Shapeways, which again, as you know, is a leading 3D printing marketplace and service. An interesting fun fact about Marlene and Shapeways. It now has over 10,000 shop owners, and recently in this past year has opened a 3D printing factory in Queens, New York. Welcome, Marlene. And last but not least, we have Venkatesh Prasad, who is the Senior Leader in Open Innovation at Ford. He's generally considered the what's next guy at Ford. His leadership has led to the development of things like Ford InSync and many other innovations that we'll look forward to talking about today. So welcome to you all. One point on logistics, we'll have a conversation up here on the stage for the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll invite all of you to the microphones here on the sides for questions and discussion. But let's go ahead and jump in. So today we're going to talk about the maker movement. Proponents will say it's driving the next industrial revolution. Some skeptics will say it's limited to tinkering. I think in the next 40 minutes or so, we want to explore some of these questions. What exactly is the maker movement? Where is it going? What is its potential economic impact? What are some of the obstacles standing in the way, and what can we do about that? So first, let's explore a bit what it is, this maker movement. And Chad, if we could get started with you, what does the maker movement mean to you?
Sure. To me, the maker movement means two things. It's about empowerment. If you look back at sort of the history of manufacturing, one of my favorite movies is Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, and it kind of shows essentially man being crushed by the machine. When I think about the maker movement, it's about man taking over the machines again and being empowered. And in Etsy's case, being able to reach a global marketplace with your goods. On the connection part, and I think this is equally, if not more important, the maker movement is about having the tools to be able to connect to other makers and learn from them around the world, not just people in your communities, but also people globally connecting via the internet. And the way that plays out on Etsy is we have something called Etsy Teams, and these are self-organized groups of Etsy sellers, and we have 7,000 of those teams around the world. Here in Detroit, there are 9 self-organized Etsy teams representing 1,200 sellers, and so this is something that didn't exist in the same way before. To give you a sense of perspective on that, from New York, where we're based, there are actually more Etsy sellers in New York than there are yellow taxis. So these people, the community and the sellers on Etsy are really everywhere, and they're able to connect with each other, and it's To me, that's the maker movement.
Yeah, yeah. In the spirit of man over machines, interestingly, Marlene, you guys are creating a platform to bring the new machines into the hands of man. Can you talk a little bit about what the maker movement means to you guys?
Well, I can, I can relate to Chad about the whole aspect of the empowerment. I mean, we have over 11,000 shop owners now at Shapeways who are selling their products online through our marketplace. And we're enabling them to become entrepreneurs and have a life. And you know, before they couldn't, the threshold was too big to start your own company producing beautiful, meaningful products. And I think if you look at the maker movement more in general, I think people can, because of Etsy, but also what we do, it's people can make very meaningful products with a high personal value. And because they can make exactly what they want. And that is really beautiful in itself.
Yeah. Let's pick up on that thread a little bit, this notion of high personal value. I mean, there is often a perception that this maker movement is about tinkerers in their garage, making things that are meaningful for them, but not high value, high volume that a lot of people are going to want. Do you guys see that as a common misperception? How would you frame it?
I do. I think it's a very common misperception, and we recently surveyed Etsy's U.S. seller base, and 75% of them surveyed, when asked, "Are you a business? What you do, a business or a hobby?" They said business. So that's the way our sellers see it, and also the types of goods that you find in marketplaces like Etsy, I think, are absolutely more than what people might call knickknacks. So, to give you a specific example, the fastest growing category on Etsy last year was furniture.
Yeah.
And the furniture on Etsy is absolutely amazing, beautifully crafted, just a really, really amazing stuff. So it's much more than that. It's basically anything that represents creativity and craft and making something really amazing.
I think it's important when we talk about creativity and craft, we don't limit it to one-offs or one unique expression that is there and nothing. It's something that can be replicated, that can be mass-produced. But it still has these intrinsic values. It tells a story. It tells a story of the person making it, designing it, but it's still something that can reach a broad marketplace. And that's the beauty of what technology is bringing to this movement.
To add on to that, if you look at what we do, 3D printing is not for knickknacks. I mean, people, like you say, we use technology in a mass-produced way to make highly personalized products. People make their wedding rings on Shapeways. Yeah. I mean, their wedding rings, if there's anything that's super special and highly personal, it's that. And there's a good reason why people actually do that, because you can get exactly the wedding ring that you want to have. And it's digitally produced, but it's exactly to your liking. And it's more logical to make it that way, because then you can express who you are.
So there's this high value segment clearly within the maker movement. Prasad would like to draw you in. Clearly Ford is thinking about maker movement and open innovation a great deal. How do you see the maker movement and its meaning for you and for Ford?
Well, thanks, Lou, and certainly thank you all. It's been great sitting here and listening to each one of you. And I think it's sort of a really fascinating time that we're at right now, where the tools for innovation have been so rapidly democratized once again. You could say 25, 30 years ago, you had the coming together of the internet and laptops, and now you have flat screens that allow for all kinds of spontaneous crowd participation. But what we're seeing here is the tangibles coming together now in incredibly democratized ways, whether it's the ability to sit and print something out and shape your own wedding ring. How much more personal could that get? Or whether it's to be able to create your own shift knob. It might be a guy called Zach Nelson, who's one of my colleagues, who actually created a shift knob for a car. That's actually incredibly cool. It's a haptic shift knob. You can Google it or check it out. But the point really is someone can walk in to a space, think of something, and get on the network, get on the internet, get both tangible tools and all the tools that you need to be able to shape your idea, whether it's using a digital form or whether it's having a conversation with someone who's on the other side of the planet, to be able to go deliver what you have from an idea to a pretty good working prototype, and then, of course, beyond that. I think this is really an incredible period in time where one might, speaking from a car maker's standpoint, you might say you have half a dozen automakers in the world, or you might have a dozen automakers, big ones, depending on how you count this. But I think there's 1 billion little automakers in the world, and growing. And by these I mean a little a. This is anyone who can automate making. And so imagine the network effect of 1 billion coming together. I use the word billion because there's 1 billion cars, trucks, and buses licensed on the planet.
Yeah.
There's a lot more off-road and many two-wheelers and other vehicles. But we're at a really fascinating time where, in some sense, sitting here in Detroit, it's particularly touching and sort of moving, because this is where a lot of this began. This is going back to Henry Ford and our learnings. Henry spoke about making the desirable affordable. We can now make that desirable entity in your mind affordable and that can be democratized in interesting ways.
It's interesting to hear a couple of different perspectives on this maker movement. One from Ford and the large company looking to draw in innovation from many sources, from many small A automotive innovators. On the other hand, we have, on your team, Chad, folks who are helping craftsmakers and entrepreneurs come up with new ideas that may not have aspirations necessarily of connecting to the automotive mass market high volume. How do you think about the connections between these two different parts of the maker movement?
I think one of the areas I think Etsy is increasingly going to touch more and more industries, or the types of activities on Etsy. There are no auto parts yet on Etsy that I'm aware of, although someone's probably going to search and prove me wrong. But I mean, what we're starting to see is the maker movement starting to really touch larger systems like retail, for example. And one of my favorite examples is just in the past year, we partnered with Nordstrom, Etsy partnered with Nordstrom, to essentially introduce Etsy sellers to Nordstrom in their local communities so that they could wholesale their goods to Nordstrom. And I think that's one way that we'll be working with the community to really reinvent retail. So what does that really mean? If you go to Seattle, San Francisco, or Chicago, Nordstrom, there's actually a display with Etsy merchandise made by local Etsy sellers. And just last week, we got a letter from one of those sellers who had gotten so much exposure from selling in Nordstrom that not only did she have to quit her job, her husband had to quit his job to help her.
Yeah.
So
it's really achieving a scale that's significant for them.
It is, and I think as we look ahead as to what happens with the maker movement, I think we're going to be increasingly surprised at how what seems small and local and small scale now will continue to grow. I think with things like 3D printing affecting.
Marlene, do you see prospects for a similar kind of retail disruption of the kind that Chad described?
Well, I see two elements there. The first element is the shop owners at Shapeways who sell their products through our platform. Mm-hmm. What we do is we take away everything what's hard about production and manufacturing. They don't have to create a website, they don't have to do customer service, they don't have to negotiate vendor contracts, they don't have to stock expensive inventory of 20,000 pieces of the same thing. So and we're enabling them scale, because if they sell well, they can sell as much as they want. They can go to really high scale and selling thousands and thousands and thousands of parts. Without creating a sweatshop in their own house. There's a second element there that you see that some of the shop owners at Shapeways who've become really successful. I think a great example is, for instance, Craig Kaplan. He is a math professor who actually decided to teach his students about parabolas, and he created a rocket cup, and we printed it for him in ceramics. And all of a sudden, this rocket cup is all over the internet. It goes viral. He's selling them like hot buns all over the place. And right now, this cup is actually selling at Fred & Friends and at Urban Outfitters. So he transitioned into retail.
Yeah, a terrific example of the potential for scaling up the economic impact of the maker movement.
Yep.
Prasad, how do you think about it in Ford's shoes? You guys opened your open innovation platform a year or so ago. Where do you see we are in the maturity curve? What does the trajectory look like in your view?
No, I think it's what we have is an open source hardware and an open source platform for tinkerers and hackers. It's called OpenXC. We also have on the product side APIs, or application programming interfaces for our sync applications. And really what I see happening is makers being able to create really interesting concepts and take it beyond the concept stage. But as has always been the case, individual makers are faced with diffusion challenges. In other words, how do they find the right market channel? How do they share what they've learned, and how do they share what's worked and what hasn't worked? They're happy to do it when asked, and they're happy to do it in small communities, but they don't have the scale necessarily. And I think that's where a firm like Ford can come in, a company like Ford can place interesting platforms that allow for this engagement with the crowds, and really to provide channels that not just communicate a finished product, because that we know how to do pretty well. Yeah. And the individuals might be able to do that through individual channels. But to be able to share what's worked and what hasn't worked with others, with peers, right?
Yep. Matt, when we were talking earlier, it sounds like that may also be something you're seeing they need for that kind of big company experience. Yeah. What are you seeing?
Well, it's an interesting thing that's happening in Detroit right now, because when we really define what's happening in the maker movement, it is that intersection of design and production all happening under one roof, if not by one person. And so the good could have some traction in the marketplace, but for it to really be something that can be scaled, that's where we really need to pull on the expertise of a Ford, of a GM, of a Chrysler, of someone who can help engineer this and engineer a process around it where it still maintains true to itself as a handcrafted item, or an item that has intrinsic value, a story to tell, but it can get to scale, it can get to markets beyond Southeast Michigan, markets beyond the United States. And that's, I think, where there's a really unique opportunity in Detroit that maybe few regions don't have, the fact that we can design, prototype, engineer, mass produce, and mass market this good all in the same city. That's kind of fun. And I think that's really going to help define where this maker movement goes in the next 10 years.
So I think there's one important point I wanted to make about the maker movement and scale, and I think that is, and this is something that we've learned in the past 8 years at Etsy. I think the maker movement also means making things in their own terms. And for many of the sellers in the Etsy community, and I hear this when I speak to them all the time, they actually enjoy that Etsy, that they don't have to scale on Etsy, that they can make things one day a week or one day a month or one day a year, and carve out space in the rest of their lives to take care of family members, pursue other hobbies, write a book, like any number of things. And so I think the flexibility, I would caution pushing too much towards how do we scale this, and recognize that part of what's remarkable about the maker movement is that it's the participation is very flexible, and you don't have to scale if you don't want.
Yeah. If I could just add, I think I completely agree with you, Chad. I think the beauty really here is that you're able to get to a market size of one, but use the resources of the globe. And I'm just sort of echoing what's been taught at the Ross Business School and other places by faculty members. So this has been pretty well studied, that if you use the tools of the age these days, these tools that allow the democratization of innovation, you can actually get to a market size of one that large firms just don't know how to get to, or don't have the aptitude or the interest in getting to. But you can use the resources of the globe. And so I think what's really interesting and unique about this discussion and this dialogue here in Detroit is that Detroit knows how to bring parts from anywhere in the world, resources from literally anywhere in the world. For 100 years, and more than 100 years, we've been doing that. So I think there's a real unique, latent, innate talent here that's so embedded in the DNA of this place. And so I think this is where a lot of this type of maker movement, I'm not saying this is the only place, but this is one of the places where you can actually have this flourish, working to a market size of one, but being able to use the resources of the globe.
And that's why I do talk about scale, because when I look at re-energizing, reinvigorating our older industrial cities, we need to find a way to bring this to scale, because that's the way that we begin to make American manufacturing relevant again, is back to this focus on craft, this focus on the individual output, of finding a way to connect that to markets beyond my aunt and uncle. or something like
I
that.
think one of the exciting things I'm hearing is there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. There are certain segments of this maker movement that are very happy and to keep it a personal contribution that they're making at a scale that is more close to them. Still deeply meaningful, though. So there's a human element, Chad, that I hear you describing. Then there are also other entrepreneurs and innovators in this movement that are looking actually to scale it up, to really drive something at a level of larger and broader reach. But the maker movement I'm hearing you guys describe has multiple segments in it, right, that we want to recognize.
And I think if you look at, the scale, whether you want it, yes or no, but what happens right now is companies like, for instance, Shapeways, we're enabling that scale if you want it to.
Yep.
If you look at how software was developed 20 years ago, then, and you would have to update it, you'd have a disk and you have to put it in your computer and you have to get it at a store. So the amount of software entrepreneurs out there, there weren't so many. And if you look at the internet and the complete proliferation of software development, how many software development entrepreneurs there are here right now, it's huge. Yeah. And the maker movement and with 3D printing, you actually enable people to become product entrepreneurs and productize, products all over the world with direct global access, so anybody can be an entrepreneur.
Yeah. So as I reflect on our conversation on this maker movement, it shows tremendous promise. And the examples you shared give us a lot of reasons to be excited. What are the obstacles that you all see that are kind of gating adoption, impact, awareness of what's possible here? What are the barriers?
One thing I think a lot about is just things like government policy. I don't think, at least here in the United States, we still haven't grappled fully with how do independent workers fit into a system and get health care and that sort of thing. Something we think a lot about at Etsy also is the idea of the micro-entrepreneur. We have the Small Business Administration and we have many institutions that support small business, but what about the micro business? Yeah. And we see challenges pop up in healthcare, as I just mentioned, but even things like internet sales tax. I've spoken to U.S. senators who can't quite believe that there are people, working from home, building these types of small businesses, and there's still a lot of education to be done on the policy side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Other barriers or obstacles that you see, Prasad, from your vantage point?
I think I sort of mentioned this before, but it's diffusion challenges that the individual maker might find. In other words, they might have a great idea, might have got a good concept, but how do they get the word out and how do others learn from that? Yeah. And there are channels today, whether it's the internet or different modalities of being able to communicate, but I think there's still a number of those diffusion challenges. Large firms know how to market and communicate what they have, but then they do it for a large market, as I said before. It's not for a one-person market or a 10-person market. So segmentation scales are very different, and so being able to get to be able to diffuse your idea, learn from other people's failures is really, really important. And it's hard to do that unless you're part of a GitHub or some kind of a group. But then when you're speaking of the right brain and the left brain having to work together to create a product that has appeal and function, you really need to be able to lower those barriers to diffusion. And I think we're getting there, but I think those are still roadblocks.
We'll pause for a moment, and to the audience, we'll invite you up to the microphones. We'll take questions here after another moment or two, so please feel free to come on up. One more question before we do. As we look ahead, is this a local movement, a national movement, a global movement? What are you seeing, and how would you encourage folks to think about it? Marlene, let's start with you.
This is a global movement with local effects. What you see is people at Shapeways, and I'm sure with other maker companies, they sell globally. They have customers all over the world. But it's local in a way too, because lots of these entrepreneurs who are selling their products, they actually, they're part of a niche community. and they're deeply ingrained into that community. And that community is maybe geographically spread all across the world, with members saying, you know, either it's a video game or some, you know, a hobby or something with jewelry, anything it can be. That community acts locally on the internet, so they know where to find each other, and they have their presence on the internet at one certain place. So it's kind of a little bit of both. They sell globally, but they act locally on the internet.
Yeah, yeah.
I think what we've seen is, in fact, it's a global movement that we're just beginning to realize here. I think with our big rush towards mass consumption, our big rush towards big box, we lost sight of what craft means, what handwork means, what artisanal means. And whereas, you know, many societies around the world still maintained that. They didn't have that big push towards consumption. So now with this kind of rise, with this kind of shared vocabulary that everyone's speaking out, the maker movement, the advent of technology, which is such as Etsy, which is breaking down the barriers to get these products out, all of a sudden we're seeing this return back to craft, back to the artisanal one-off goods. You know, the rugs and the copper pots of the Middle East, the, you know, widgets and leather goods and watches of Detroit. So,
I mean, it's absolutely global. You know, last year on Etsy, there were transactions in 200 countries, and 1 million sellers across all of those countries, and, you know, 30 million people registered on the site all over the world. But it's also got a very local element, and you know, one of my favorite examples of kind of what Etsy means, and I think this starts to is one of the answers to the question, can the maker movement remake America? Is last year I got a tweet from Mayor Larry Morrissey from Rockford, Illinois, who's actually in the audience today, who was on a panel, asking if we at Etsy could, if we wanted to talk about building an Etsy economy in Rockford. And Rockford's a city that's been struggling in similar ways to Detroit. Mm-hmm. And I responded to Mayor Morrissey, again, this is all happening on Twitter, and the head of the local Rockford Etsy team, and remember these are self-organized teams using the Etsy platform, responded to both of us and said, I want to work with you guys to make this happen. So here you have this global platform based in Brooklyn, Etsy, connecting a mayor with the head of a team of Etsy sellers in his community. And so in that sense, I think platforms like Etsy are intensely local. One other quick anecdote, we had a Greek seller who was doing really well on Etsy, and of course the Greek economy has been struggling for quite some time. She tried to pay taxes on her earnings on Etsy, and her tax form was rejected because the Greek authorities didn't believe that you could make things like you make on Etsy and sell them and make money. She was an accountant, so she went to the Greek tax office and painstakingly took them through the whole business, and so they accepted her tax payment. I think that's the hardest I've ever seen anyone work to pay taxes. But it's an amazing thing, and I think in Rockford, in Athens, we have people talking about how this maker movement is changing their lives.
So there's awareness building needed at multiple levels
Yes.
to really make this
Pay
go.
your taxes.
Yeah. A related question. So the examples you gave were quite inspiring. If we look around the globe and we look at what's happening in the maker movement in the country, where are we? Are we well positioned? Are we ahead of the game? What do you see, and where would you place us relative to what's happening elsewhere? Prasad, what?
Dale Doherty, who runs Maker Media, recently sort of thought through quite a bit of this, not surprisingly, and sort of started making a case for how the maker movement is in fact transforming into a maker market. And I think it's worthwhile considering that in the context of your earlier question about is this local or global. And I'd say that we actually are getting to a very interesting point in time where the world is getting smaller and the village is getting more and more global and bigger. Just last weekend, there was an article in the New York Times about how MIT recruited a student from Mongolia as a freshman, in part, mostly because of what he was making in his garage. Mm-hmm. right? And so he was putting electronics together and making something really interesting. MIT is a world unto itself. It's a big flat world, but this maker sitting out in Mongolia, high school kid, got recruited. And so it's a really interesting story where I think the movement is now becoming a market driven by all this sort of technology-enabled innovation that's really bringing us all together.
Very good.
I think you look at the infrastructure that we have in this country, and you look at the definition of maker, design meets production, and you look at the two core indicators for that. World-class universities, world-class art and design schools, some of which were in the city right here. And then you look at the technological infrastructure that we have. That intersection of those two elements really places America in a strong position to be a net attractor of makers, but also to cultivate our own community of makers.
I'll look to the audience now. Do we have any questions? Yes, please.
Hi, Tira Hightower from Inkwell, BC. My question, I have a two-part question. First, I want to say that with Shapeways and Etsy, I think what is really compelling and really fantastic are the larger implications of empowering the creative individuals out there. I think by putting, and I think Jack Dorsey is going to speak later, said Square, his payment platform, came out of the need of a friend who was selling glass works at an art fair to process a payment for a sale that he couldn't otherwise have. That was the origination of Square. So it's empowering the local artisans and the individuals. But my question about is, there was a great piece in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago with Jay Leno talking about, who's a car enthusiast, and he said his whole garage, all of his vehicles now, the people that work on his cars, they're entirely self-sufficient. They don't have to go out to anybody to get parts for the vehicles. If something's broken and it needs to be fixed, they can either take an old part, scan it in, modify it, print out a new part, or just create the part they need and print it out there with 3D printing. Now, from the perspective of someone like Ford, how are you positioned to handle the fact that what the implications of what 3D printing mean in your future, not only how you can harness it and use it for prototypes and things, but how will it affect your business, your parts, your suppliers as you go forward? And two parts to this question, what about IP? If people can create something and upload a product design to the internet and anyone can print it, how do you protect your manufacturing IP when you have that on the table?
That could take a whole session. But clearly we have thought about it. To your first question about people printing their own parts, obviously we are a tightly regulated business for all good reasons. And so things that are regulated will stay regulated and have to therefore be regulated, and there's testing and procedures involved. So there's those hurdles that come just because we want to do the right thing as members of society. As individual entrepreneurs, we might have ideas, but as members of society, we have a certain responsibility. But outside of that, there's a lot of ways to create value to the car as a platform. The auto business today, as I said before, there's about 1 billion cars, trucks, and buses out on the roads. The aftermarket business has upwards of $300 billion in annual revenue. I'm not sure if it's a US number or a global number. So it's pretty big and thriving today. So it's already happening. And we know how to work with all the makers in the world, whether they're the aftermarkets or us and our competitors. So I think that's a happy world just getting happier, I would say, in many, many different ways. To the second point, I think intellectual property is there, again, to protect the David and the Goliaths of the world. And they're there for good reasons. But intellectual property shouldn't stifle innovation. It's actually meant to promote innovation. And so with the democratization of technologies and innovation tools, there's going to be a number of ways to allow the crowds to innovate and create various versions, and then for those who are interested in stitching together those innovations to create added value. So I think if you take a platform notion, each platform layer can be protected, but you can create something on top of that that now adds value. And so I think you're going to see a lot of that.
Thank you, Prasad. I think we have a question over here.
You guys had a great discussion, but there's an element that I was hoping to add that kind of goes to particularly some of the things that Matt and Chad have been talking about, which is more the cultural and even spiritual dimension of what this movement suggests long term. And I will say the reason we had Rodney Brooks in the previous session is, among other things, I personally believe the pace of robotics and automation and the transformation of jobs globally is going to be much more rapid than most people think. And it is a great thing. It will replace a lot of tedious work. But there's two things that I think may be worth thinking about. One is the disappearance of the hand and the sense of craft, which is a word I think Matt brought into the conversation, but also the need in a future when we really could, this is more hypothetical, but I actually believe it's a real possibility, see a world where people really do have to work less and have the opportunity to express themselves more, and maybe we'll really need to do that. So I'd just like for anybody there to muse on some of the consequences of a little longer term evolution of the maker movement and what it might mean culturally.
I'll give it a shot. So one book that really inspires me sort of in thinking about the way the world should work economically is a book by the economist E.F. Schumacher. It was written, I believe, in 1972, and it's called Small is Beautiful. And I'll try to talk about kind of the cultural, spiritual parts. In that book, he talks about the various kind of anti-technology, anti-machinery movements that have happened, and talks about labor-saving devices in a specific way. And as I remember it sitting up here on stage, he talks about how machinery that is good is that machinery which doesn't remove the essentially human part of the work. And so I think when I look at things like 3D printing, and I look at even what's happening on Etsy, where jewelry designers are using CAD to design jewelry pieces and they're printing it out on a 3D printer, that's still a creative act. They're not slaving away at a machine, stamping this 1,000 times a day. And so when I think about the long-term culture and the way technology will advance, I believe really in a brighter future based on this type of technology. I'll give you a very quick example. If you study the history of something like the sewing machine, which is, sewing machines are used on Etsy by many, many, many Etsy sellers. The sewing machine, when it was introduced, caused riots. Tailors in France decided that it was going to take their work away and this sort of thing. And I imagine if I announced on Etsy that we were going to take all the sewing machines away because they were machines and you weren't actually, doing it completely by hand, I would have a riot on my hands. Mm-hmm. So I really believe that as these machines develop, we have sort of humanity and the means to have them develop in a way that supports our spiritual selves and the culture that we're creating. It's just going to change how things are specifically done.
I look at it as kind of a function of the marketplace, and we're living in a world of increasing scarcity. So when you live in a world of increasing scarcity, what do? To provide value, to engage consumers. You focus on the craftsmanship of the materials, of the limited resources. And then you craft a narrative around that craftsmanship that really get people to see value on that handwork, whether it is facilitated by a machine or whether it's just in an old school blacksmith shop. But as we continue to deplete resources, that's just going to be so much more, a much more important part of the dialogue.
And Marilyn, you also brought up the wedding ring example, something that has incredibly high emotional and personal value. What are you seeing?
Well, if you think about it, a lot of people have the innate need to feel recognized, feel that they matter. What they do, if you look at mass-produced goods around you, and we're surrounded by them every single day, you actually see that these goods, they're all the same. And quite often they lack a little bit of heart because they're made super efficient, but they're all the same. Our computers, our cars, sorry. And it's very hard to, with the current mass-produced products that we use, it's all the same, so there's no way to distinguish ourselves. So we start to customize them by putting stickers on them, or going to a car dealer or to one of those shops where you can get your car right trimmed. And so we do all these things to distinguish ourselves and to make us feel happier with the products that surround us. And if you look at what the maker movement can do there by providing these highly personalized goods, people start to surround them with goods that are much more things that are really meaningful to them, like the wedding ring, and hopefully will provide a few more smiles in this world.
Yeah, very good. I think we have time for one more question, please.
Hi, I'm Nancy Farrell-Husgan. I'm sorry, everybody, it's like up here again, but I also work with a magazine called Edible Wow. Have you guys heard of Edible Communities at all? Yeah. Basically, this is all about the local food movement, which is another maker movement.
Yep.
And Michigan, after automotive, second is agriculture. So I believe there's a huge opportunity to take mobile technology, basically Etsy, and do the same thing for food.
Okay.
And I worked at Kraft Foods for a long time, so I know that side of things, and I've been working in this for 5 years. So what do you guys think of that whole concept?
I think you're exactly right. I mean, there's a whole set of startups in that space right now. Literally in Brooklyn, in the neighborhood where we're located, there's a startup called Farmigo, which is working in this space. So I agree. I mean, we've had conversations inside Etsy, like how do we get into agriculture? And there are a bunch of complexities, and I think other startups will do it better than us. But absolutely, the same spirit of community and connecting and global, local, like all of those things absolutely connect with food and agriculture.
And I just have to tell you, when I found out I was coming here this morning or last night, I looked at the schedule and I saw that you were here, and I put a Facebook out and I said, there's a lot of big woods there, but I'm most excited about Etsy. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
I think we're coming to the end of our time. I want to thank our panelists. I think you've given us a lot to think about and a lot to be excited about, and what the maker movement really can mean. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank all of you.
Thank you.